Just a little bit of background. You heard about the Cardiovascular Research Foundation, but for those of you who don't know or maybe just coming to one of these seminars for the first time, we started these mini med school seminars initially about 4 years ago now. We host these programs. There's usually one every 3 to 4 months, so now that you've come to one, you'll be on the mailing list. You can look out for future programs. I think the next one we're planning is in February. But the program really had the idea to raise awareness about heart disease in women, and then we found that people actually, it wasn't just specific to women, that we needed to raise awareness about just heart disease in general, and then ways to empower people to prevent heart disease, right? And so that's where we sort of have done a lot of these topics. We have ones on stress and heart disease, diabetes, and the link to heart disease. So if anyone is interested, if you've missed any of the previous seminars and you want to go online, our website is crf.org/WHHI for Women's Heart Health Initiative, and they're recorded and they're available online if you ever want to watch them. They're also on the CRF YouTube channel. So I'm going to jump right in because we have a lot to cover today. So the title of my talk is called The Biology of Weight Gain. And the sad truth, or the scary truth, is that about 160 million Americans are either obese or overweight. And what that means is a BMI over 25 to 30 for overweight, and over 30 is being classified as obese. That's more than 60% of women who fall into this category, and about 3/4 of men. So that's very scary. About a quarter of Americans live with something called metabolic syndrome, which is an independent risk factor for both heart disease, stroke, as well as for diabetes itself. And so the definition of metabolic syndrome is basically a waist circumference for women. If you have any of the three of any of these, for women I'll talk about specifically, if your waist circumference is greater than 35 inches, that's 1 point. If your triglyceride level, the fats that circulate in your bloodstream, is greater than 150. If your HDL, so always think of HDL as healthy, H is healthy, so if your healthy cholesterol is less than 50 in women have more HDL because of our hormones, because of estrogen, so you want that number to be above 50. If it's less than that, that could be a part of metabolic syndrome. If your systolic blood pressure, or the top number, is more than 130, or if the bottom number is more than 85. That's another point. Or if your fasting glucose, meaning the blood sugar level when fasting, is greater than 100. So if you have 3 of those points, that could be metabolic syndrome. So now, just about now, everybody's thinking about, oh, well, where do I fall into this? Where does my weight fall? So I'm just going to put this up here for a minute. If you look at your height along the left-hand side and then go across, and you can get a sense of where you fall. It's only meant to stay amongst yourselves, don't share. But just so you know, you have some sense of where you fall in the BMI range. You can also just type in BMI calculator in your phone, and it'll come up. All right, so there's definitely an obesity epidemic, right? So we characterize this as a public health crisis, and it goes hand in hand with the diabetes epidemic. So if you look at the rates of both obesity and diabetes in the US from the 1990s to now, they both have been exponentially increasing. And the reason why this is important is that obesity by itself is not a risk factor for heart disease just by itself. Being obese doesn't put you at risk for having heart disease, but it's because of all the other things that go along with obesity, like the derangements in cholesterol, like problems with blood pressure, blood sugar. It's all these things that go hand in hand, but most importantly, the rise in diabetes that's been linked to the rising rates of obesity is the driving factor for this. And diabetes is a major risk factor for heart disease, if not the major one. And about 80% of new cases of type 2 diabetes in the US are attributable to overweight and obesity. So it really is a major problem. There's more than 30 million Americans who live with diabetes, and about 7 million of them don't even know that they have it. So this clearly is an important problem. So let's get down to what happens in our bodies that makes some people more predisposed to weight gain, some people who can live on pizza, cake, and ice cream and not gain an ounce, versus others that just look at something unhealthy and they start putting on pounds. And it's sort of it's a balance. If you think about it as a net equation, the calories that one consumes versus the calories that they expend or that they burn off, right? And that can be affected by a lot of different things, and we'll talk about some of them. But there's an interplay between genetics, the way that your body's uses energy uses your calories, right? So your basal metabolic rate, or your energy expenditure just to live and breathe, varies amongst people. It also affects, genetics can also affect the way that you respond to food, why some people have certain types of cravings, your appetites, signals for feeling full. So genetics plays a big role in this. And then obviously the environment plays a huge role. So we know that the rates of obesity have been increasing since the 1970s. That's not because genetics are drastically changing in humans since the 1970s, it's because the external environment is changing. So we'll talk about this as well. So if in this equation, if someone consumes more calories than their body is burning off, they have they store those calories, their body stores those calories as fat cells or adipose tissue. So let's talk about the role of genetics. There have been more than 400 different genes that have been implicated in obesity. That doesn't mean that it's genetically predetermined, but some people do have a strong predisposition. So if both of your parents, if both of somebody's parents are obese, they have up to 80% chance of being obese themselves. These are the people, these are the families, the groups that are going to struggle with weight for their entire lives unless under the supervision of a medical team or a doctor that's going to guide them through this. Oftentimes these are the people that end up needing bariatric surgery or weight loss medications. And we'll talk about that when we get to our expert on obesity in just a few minutes. And if you think about why is it that the body does this, the body rarely does things that would harm us, right? The body's pretty good at preserving things. So if you think about it from evolution, back in the hunter-gatherer days, this makes perfect sense. When the prey runs away, or if it was a bad crop season, the people whose bodies could store the people whose bodies could store fat lived longer, while the people who couldn't store fat died. So this was definitely an evolutionary advantage. And now, of course, it's a curse because we no longer live in an environment where food is scarce. It's actually the exact opposite, right? Food is everywhere. I'm going to skip this slide. It's just talking about how there are certain determinants, even in utero, that can affect somebody's chances of being overweight in the future. So if you are born to a mother who is a smoker or a diabetic, you're more likely to be an overweight adult. I also find it interesting, they said that babies who are breastfed for more than 3 months as opposed to less than 3 months are more likely to be a normal weight. If you're breastfed for less than 3 months, you're more likely to be overweight. And I can't quite put a reason to that. But it's definitely true that we live in an obesogenic environment, right? Our environment just breeds overweight and obesity. And that goes for it's a number of different reasons. But we live in a culture that emphasizes eating often and eating a lot. A lot of our social gatherings are centered around food. Portion sizes are huge. People who, I don't remember the last time you go to a nice restaurant, you're able to actually complete your portion, your meal. Food is readily available. Think about the last time you went to a sporting event or to the mall, you can't walk, or a city block, you can't walk 10 feet, 20 feet without having a food vendor available. The foods are actually being packed with more and more calories. So even if you look at fast food, there's about triple the amount of calories in a fast food meal than there were about 20, 30 years ago. And they're actually being engineered to be highly addictive. And this is a really important point because thinking about obesity and unhealthy eating habits as an addiction, the same way that alcohol and drugs can be an addiction, it can stimulate the same reward centers in the brain and can cause the same types of cravings that people with these sorts of addictions can have. So it really is a physical problem. We all know that eating healthy is so much more expensive than eating junk, right? If you go to the grocery store and you buy actual foods, that's a lot more expensive than just buying a prepared, processed meal at your local drive-through. So that, and it's a lot of it has to do with marketing and the way that these foods are being advertised. So a lot of these low-fat foods are actually packed with more calories because there's all this added sugar to it that makes it taste better. And so low-fat could actually be worse for you. And it's just true that we're exercising less and less, and that's true for children as well. The amount of gym time in schools is cut down. It's a different world now. I don't send my kids out to play in the backyard and just run around and then come back at dinner time or when it gets dark. That doesn't exist anymore. So it's a scarier world. People are driving their kids everywhere. Physical activity is pre-planned and very expensive, and so you really have to get your kids to exercise. It takes effort. And then just adults in general, our productivity is measured by the amount of time we're spent sitting at a desk or spent in front of a computer. And so that also leads to just a very sedentary lifestyle. Cars are all over the place. People don't walk anymore unless you're like living in the city and you don't have a car. You could just put your hand up. Now there's apps to even get a car to come to you. But cars are just everywhere. So people, I find it hilarious during holiday season when a perfectly healthy individual is like fighting with the little old lady to get the spot that's closest to the mall entrance. It's like you could walk. The extra 20 feet won't hurt. Right, we fight for parking spots closest to the entrance of a mega store so that we can limit the amount of physical activity we have to do in the day. And then TVs. Every family has at least one TV, if not more. The amount of TV that the average American watches is 4 hours a day. Children who watch more than 2 hours a day are more likely to be overweight individuals. And it's not even that they do something that isn't sedentary in the time that they're not spending watching TV. Even if they're sitting there coloring, it's something about watching TV. You're sitting there snacking, most likely, is just a predisposition to being overweight. So what is it that goes on in our brain? What is our body trying to tell us to regulate this chaos, right? So why is it that some people feel full after eating a small portion, whereas others could just eat and eat? And it's actually a big interplay that's very complicated. But the appetite center in our brain is located in the hypothalamus, which is a small area that sort of sits in the middle of your brain. And it receives signals internally and also from the rest of your body, so the GI tract, the fat cells, the pancreas, all sending signals to either say, hey, I'm hungry, or hey, I'm full, and that's what makes you get the feeling of hunger and satiety. So the key hunger hormone that our body produces is called ghrelin. Ghrelin is produced by the stomach, by the lining of the stomach in response to being hungry. So being an empty stomach creates or produces ghrelin that goes to the brain and stimulates hunger. So people start eating. It also inhibits the effect of leptin, which is supposed to be the opposite. It's supposed to make you feel full when you've had enough. The satiety hormones are more complicated. So there's a whole lot of signals that come from your periphery that try to go to the brain and tell your body that you're full and to stop eating. But this gets very complicated, and I'll just highlight a few. They come from the stomach, from the small intestine, the large intestine, the pancreas, from the fat cells. So they're coming from all over your body. And I'll just touch on a couple of them because some of them are actually really interesting in how they interplay to other conditions that we're talking about. So insulin, everybody always thinks of insulin as a diabetes hormone, right? What does this have to do with diabetes? What does this have to do with weight gain? But they're actually very intimately linked. Insulin levels respond very rapidly in response to a large meal, especially one that's high in sugars or carbohydrates. Obesity actually leads to insulin resistance, meaning even though your body creates the insulin, your muscle cells, your body's cells are not able to utilize the sugar in your bloodstream because it's not responding to it. So it's resistant to insulin. And so what your body does in response to that is crank out more insulin because it thinks you don't have any. So it's just this feedback loop where that's what leads to type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance from this process. And insulin, actually, high levels of insulin tells your body to store more and more fat. So that's why insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes actually increases weight gain the same way that obesity can lead to diabetes. And ways to lower your insulin naturally are to cut back on the simple and refined carbohydrates and to increase fiber intake. That's been shown in the past. You don't have to count calories for it. Just modify the type of foods you're ingesting, and it should induce results by itself. The next one I want to mention is GLP-1. This is only something I mentioned because there's drugs that now you may hear about this, but it's an incretin hormone, which means it's released in response to oral ingestion of nutrients, and your body makes it and secretes it. It's supposed to tell your body, it's a satiety hormone. It's supposed to tell your brain that you are full, you can stop eating. It delays gastric emptying, stimulates insulin secretion, so all good things. And because of its effects on blood sugar in the pancreas, it's actually a drug target for that's useful to treat type 2 diabetes. So there are medications called GLP-1 receptor agonists that have proven benefits in people who have type 2 diabetes to lower blood sugar and also have some improved cardiovascular outcomes. And then leptin is actually a really interesting hormone, and the last one I kind of want to delve into because it's sort of a paradox. So leptin, again, it's a satiety hormone. It's supposed to tell you you're full. It's supposed to do the opposite of what ghrelin says, right? So it's secreted by the fat cells, so It's secreted to tell your brain that you don't need to eat. And the interesting part is that everybody sort of has a different set point. So you have a different threshold and that's usually genetically determined, right? So there's leptin sort of makes a threshold on when you have enough fat stores versus when your body needs more energy, based on how much energy you need to carry out your metabolic functions for the day. So that varies amongst individuals. And so it would make sense that obese people have a lot of fat, and so they shouldn't be hungry, and so their leptin levels should be low, and so they should not feel hungry. But what they actually found is the exact opposite, that obesity is associated with unusually high levels of leptin. And this story is going to sound really similar to the insulin and type 2 diabetes story. So people who are obese or overweight can develop leptin resistance, the same way that you can develop insulin resistance. So even though the leptin levels are very high, your brain is not getting the signal because it can't cross into your brain. It's not getting the signal to stop eating. And so people who are obese have high levels of leptin, but still are constantly overeating because your body doesn't get that satiety signal. I know that's a little complicated and convoluted, but that's, it's the way that the body works, is just built on these biofeedback loops. So 2 other points that I want to mention before we talk about things you can do to change this, right? But there are some medication classes that can lead to weight gain, and I just want to briefly mention them in case people are curious. So antidepressants, antipsychotics, anti-epilepsy drugs can all, several of them can be associated with weight gain. These are obviously things, because they work on the brain, it has something to do with that. These are obviously important medications, so if that is a concern that anybody has, or if you know anybody who has this concern, it's really important to discuss it with your individual doctor. Some of the diabetes drugs like insulin, sulfonylureas can also cause weight gain. That's unlike metformin and some of the other medications that are the newer classes of drugs that actually are associated with weight loss. So metformin is the first line therapy for type 2 diabetes, and that's actually associated with weight loss. Steroid hormones, if you know anybody who's taking chronic steroids, like for a chronic condition or for a transplant or something like that, steroids can also cause weight gain as well as birth control pills, oral contraceptives. And then there are some conditions, and a few that are more prevalent in women that I want to mention, conditions themselves that can cause weight gain or are associated with weight gain. So hypothyroidism is one of them. It's very common, so it's more common in women than it is in men. It's associated with other things, like it just slows down your metabolism, so it's associated with weight gain, some changes in your hair, voice, skin changes. If that's something that's a recent change in weight or an increase in weight that's unexpected, it's something that you can readily check with your primary care doctor. Cushing syndrome is very rare. It's associated with high levels of circulating cortisol, which is a stress hormone. Sleeping less than 7 hours per night has been linked with weight gain, and so the reason for that is likely a disbalance in the ghrelin and leptin. You get hungrier, you're sending hunger signals in the middle of the night. Think about what the person at 2 in the morning is doing. They're not like on a treadmill, right? They're sitting there in front of the TV, like chowing down on some chips. So that's linked with being overweight. Stress, anxiety, depression, any of those conditions can sometimes just alter eating habits and can lead people to have weight gain. It can also do the opposite, and it can cause weight loss. PCOS is an interesting one. It's called polycystic ovarian syndrome. It's not uncommon, but this is something that also should be looked for by your primary care doctor if usually young people have a constellation of symptoms. It's defined by high levels of insulin, but also testosterone. So you find some irregularities in menstruation, hair growth in places women don't usually have hair growth, possible infertility, weight gain. It's a problem with the ovaries, but it can affect a lot of different. These patients are often, because of the insulin resistance, can often be diabetic as well. And then fluid retention is usually from end stages of later types of conditions. So I won't get too much into that. So in conclusion, obviously it's a very complex interplay on how our body regulates hunger and satiety. Genetics play a significant role in how our bodies utilize that information, but it's not hopeless. And maintaining healthy diet and exercise choices really is the best bet in achieving and maintaining a healthy weight.